Good afternoon. My name is Lee McWhorter, and I'm the instructor for the cybersecurity program at WashU. Today, we begin the second session of Security Foundations, and this is the first weekly lecture for the Security Foundations course. Now, we have a number of new starts this week. Hopefully, some will show up, and we'll be watching this video, of course, later. These videos are meant to complement and support the online materials at the Learning Management System website. And so we want to add some additional information. What I want to do in these video series is to support the classes is to focus on trying to hit some of the key points in the materials, and to really work on any challenging concepts. If we have any questions, of course, or we've had questions over the course of the series, then I will try to address those in these lectures. The lectures are set up so that we will follow one lecture per week for the 2-3-week course. We have the first lecture today will cover our first 5 lessons in the system, which are Introduction to Security Foundations, Security Roles, Attacks and Threat Actors, Information Security, and Defense Basics. And so we will talk about each of those, and then next week, when we have the other second lecture in the series, we will talk about the last 6 lessons in this class. One of the things to note is that in addition to these videos that we do for each section, we have had another section that started a few weeks back. So those videos are already posted. They will be similar, but I may have different examples or say different things. And so you may, if you have the time, or if you're having any issues on a particular concept, you may want to look back at the previous videos. They will all be under the playlist on the YouTube site. And so the idea being that you can maybe get different examples, and of course over time as you go through the course, and we have various students make some of the classes, and we have some interaction and things, some of that may be different, and different question and answer may be there. Generally speaking, we'll lecture for the first 45 or so minutes, and if we have people in the room and have any questions, then we will answer any questions. I may run a little long sometimes. I have a tendency to chat and try to fill as much detail as I can. And of course, if you have any questions about any of this, whether you're in the material, you're watching the video, or listening to the lecture, please feel free to contact myself or the mentor so that we can help you with this information and be able to get you moving forward quickly. This first lesson, of course, is an introduction to security foundations, and it lays the groundwork for a lot of the things that we'll be doing within the entire cybersecurity program. It provides the basic foundations of a lot of key terms and concepts that are very important, and these things will come back again and again throughout the various courses. And so let's just begin. In the first lesson of the Security Foundations course, we talk about some very basic terminology, defining things, and I'm not going to, unless they're more difficult concepts, as I said, or I feel like I need to provide a different example or a different definition potentially. I'm not going to just sit there and read from the portal to you, of course. So I'm going to hit the highlights. But we, of course, define what security is and what cybersecurity is. We have a lot of key terms that if you have any issues with, they're pretty basic, but if you have any issues or you're not quite clear, please let us know, because we're going to see things like risks and vulnerabilities and threats and threat actors and all these terms throughout the course. And so you need to get them down now so that they're clear to you as you go on throughout the rest of the program. We also cover some of the basic concepts of, and we'll talk in later lessons in more detail about some of the basic security concepts. But one of the real big pieces that I really want to emphasize in the first lesson, that I always think is something that you need to wrap your mind around, is the CIA triad. The CIA triad is not our Central Intelligence Agency. In the case of cybersecurity, it refers to confidence, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are 3 objectives, 3 goals, 3 things that we must provide to information and within the information security space. So the idea is that these are sort of the driving goals, in addition to any organizational goals we need to accomplish, and we'll talk more about those later. But the goals are, these are the sort of core goals that we need to accomplish when we're attempting to protect information and information assets. One of the things we talk about is that we have to protect information in all of its forms. Information, and for the most part in our realm, is of course zeros and ones, but it's being processed in memory on a computer while it's being worked with. It's being stored on a computer in some kind of file or database. And then, of course, it's being transmitted from one machine to another, whether that's just client server or that's being transmitted to another party. And so we, as security professionals, must make sure that we take into account all those stages and provide these three protections: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so what we're trying to do, of course, is make sure that data stays confidential. Only the people who needed access to it and should get access to it should be able to reach it. And then, of course, we have to maintain the integrity of our data. Even if, the data wasn't stolen, if somehow it was manipulated, changed, then, of course, that also could cause problems. That could be corruption of source code if somebody was trying to mess with a software company and, sort of handicap a competitor by breaking their code. Given the revision control systems today, that would probably be hard to do, but in principle, that's an idea. There's the old movie that's referenced in cyberspace every once in a while, War Games, where the young man, before he gets involved in damn near starting a nuclear war with the entire world, playing with the computer, he actually hacks into his school system to change his grades. So that obviously is changing the integrity of that data. And so we want to protect the integrity of our data, make sure our sales numbers are accurate, our customer information stays protected, etc. And then we have to provide for availability. That's, of course, a big part of our job in IT and period, let alone in security, is to make sure that all the IT resources and servers and applications and databases are available to the people who need them so they can get their jobs done. As I always tell students, in IT and definitely in cybersecurity, we're not doing our job in a vacuum. We're not securing the network for the network's sake. We're not building new networks and adding new software all the time just for fun because we're a bunch of geeks. And while hopefully if we enjoy this field that we are, and that's what we do, what we're doing it for is to achieve the objectives of the organization we work for. If that is a private company selling products, we want to help that. If it's a nonprofit attempting to raise money or do worthy things, then we want to help that. And along the way, we have to provide confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all the data and resources within the organization. So it's one of the key concepts that you'll see again and again, and you will see on certification test type of questions as well. So I really wanted to emphasize the CIA triad and how it is kind of a model that you need to look at while you go through other parts of the course, as you're working on later, and I'm just going to hit it high level, but security plans or network designs or all kinds of things, you take these things into account: the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data. You want to make sure that you've accounted for that in the various policies you produce, and the designs and architectures you produce, and the procedures you put in place. So after setting the basics in that intro lesson one with a lot of key terms and some basic concepts, we move into talking a little bit more about what are some of the roles within the security space. And in lesson two, we look at security roles from two different points of view. Initially, we look at it from a conceptual point of view. We talk about owner of data or owner of resources. We talk about a user. And of course, the vast majority of people from our point of view in cybersecurity within corporations are users of data, whether they're admins or salespeople or even fairly senior people. If their role, though, is just to use the data, then they're just conceptually a user of the data. They're not an administrator, a custodian, or an owner of the data. And those terms are all defined in the courseware, but these are conceptual roles. Owners usually would be, potentially the VP of sales may be the owner of the sales data and the sales prospect list. And then somebody who has the role of managing that server, managing those databases, then would have other roles. And of course, then the various salespeople sitting on calling centers or going out and making calls. Even technically a process, sort of a mailing list software system, could be a user of that data by accessing it. And so we have to take into account the different roles from a conceptual point of view. Sometimes this comes into play once again in test questions. It also comes into play in the development of cybersecurity policies and procedures. Sorry, Cedar fever is through the roof here in Texas, so I apologize for that. The other types of roles we talk about are more practical day-to-day roles that people within this field will take on. And we look at roles across the whole industry, and there's only a sampling, admittedly, of different types of roles, system administration roles, security roles, more managerial roles. And so we might be talking about sort of things from an entry level of sort of a systems analyst, security analyst, all the way up to the senior level of a chief security officer or something. And so we talk about those different roles and give you an idea of sort of some different paths through the cybersecurity profession. While you are all in this program because you're excited about this field and you want to learn about things that you can do to protect systems and networks, and no doubt learn about hacking and countermeasures and all the fun stuff that we will do throughout this course, you are also, have different opportunities, and you'll start off in some kind of maybe security admin or security analyst, or maybe go work for an independent as sort of a security consultant. But as you move through your career, you have lots of different paths. You can stay more independent, maybe start your own company, do all kinds of things, consulting, assessments, pen testing. You can do those roles for organizations where you move into different roles. And of course, ultimately, somebody's got to go on and lead these teams. And so there's different more senior roles within IT and security that you may move to if you, in addition to all your tech skills, can master some of the nuances of management and interpersonal skills that are necessary, and project management and budgeting, and some of the things that will be important. Especially, we'll have a lot of fun in this course with lots of toys to play with and lots of techniques to learn, but we will learn a lot about the policies and frameworks that are very important in this field, because people in this field are responsible for either creating them or implementing them, etc. And so you'll have different roles, and you, even all the way to somebody who will take the job of being the auditor of these type of systems. The last thing we talk about in that lesson is just some bright news, some shiny news, if you will, of the future. There is similar stats to I've talked about in some of the webinars. If you may, to support this program, if you may have seen one of those, there are various estimates, but let's just say well over 1 million jobs worldwide right now unfilled in this space. Now, they're not all entry level, but a good chunk of them are, and then a lot of them are other areas as well, and various roles higher up into the system, and that's expected to grow by, I've seen numbers from 10, 15, 20, 30%, as high as 1.8 to maybe 2 million unfilled jobs over the next 5 or 6 years. So there's a lot of opportunity in this space, and it's just constantly evolving. Every day it seems like we hear about some new exploit that's found, some new breach that happens. And this is one of the big things that in this space today, the challenges are just immense. And so as the challenges grow, then the demand grows, and it kind of makes sense in that regard. So after the overview of the various roles and giving you some idea of some of the roles that people would take in organizations, both conceptually and as well as very, specifically in different example, we then move into talking our first look at attacks and threat actors. And we talk about all different kinds of attacks. This is one of those areas where some of you who may have some experience or have, been playing in this space for a while, everybody's supposed to have a degree of experience coming into this program. But depending on your interest and what areas you've been in, maybe you're familiar with most of these. And the sort of standard attacks that have been around for a while, we almost all are. I mean, everybody's heard of phishing and malware and different kinds of attacks or breaches. But one of the things that we're seeing is a bunch of newer types of attacks, things that weren't even possible a dozen years ago, if not even that, if less. Things like, because of something called the Internet of Things, which is just a phrase, and we'll talk about it more in the program, a fair amount actually, is just a phrase that basically is all about all these things that are now being hooked up to the internet. Years ago, we didn't have coffee makers or refrigerators or thermostats or all just on and on the internet. We had computers, we had maybe smartphones and a few tablets and various things so many years ago. But today, we are seeing just this explosive growth of embedded systems being built into anything from cars. And so, of course, every year we're seeing new attacks and new attack vectors. One of the largest denial of service attacks recorded in the internet's history to date was carried out by a botnet, which is just a phrase for somebody has taken over and made into bots or zombies all of these devices. Historically, those have been computers on the internet. And that's still a favorite target of attackers, but they're really starting to shift their attention, especially in certain areas like this one, denial of service, to all these devices This botnet literally had, I don't know, hundreds, millions of devices, and then they were able to turn all of that bandwidth, and sending commands to another machine to just overwhelm it with a denial of service attack. And the sheer amount of traffic that they produced was the largest has been seen so far. And of course, they're expecting, and the numbers here are just even wilder than the numbers on the jobs in future of cybersecurity. But the numbers and predictions of how many numbers of connected devices are just insane. We are going to face so many more challenges in the IT space and in the cybersecurity space going forward because of this. And so, it used to be that you wouldn't have thought that somebody could break into your network through a coffee maker, but that's entirely possible. All these mobile devices and smart devices that companies have to deal with, we will talk about things like that throughout. So there are all kinds of standard attacks that have been around for a long time, breaking into sites and all this. And if you have any issues or questions about any of the specific attacks, you're not quite understanding how it's done, one, ask us, let us know, myself or the mentor, and we will be happy to help. Chat in the chat channels, and other members of the class will be able to help you as well. And then, of course, we will be covering more of these later in the program. So this is just the overview of these things. Some of these we will actually kind of, at least to a degree, simulate and do ourselves. So in addition to the different attack types, we talk a bit about what are called threat actors. This is one of those key terms from lesson 1, threats and threat actors. And threat actors are the class of people and elements that can basically take advantage and cause a threat, can take advantage of some vulnerability, and potentially cause problems to our organization and the information we're trying to protect. So, of course, everybody's heard the phrase hacker, and hacker has gone through a whole cycle of definitions. It used to be in the earliest days a positive term, actually. There was a book called Hackers, the Heroes of the Digital Revolution, which is a great book looking in the early days and how they used to have hacking contests at MIT where a professor would write up a problem on the board and tell all these engineers and programmers to solve it in code, but with the fewest lines of code. And I really wish everybody wrote that way today, instead of all the various tools we use to make our software bigger and bigger, and how Word and all these programs. It's like, I'm not sure I really need another feature in Firefox. I just want it to surf browsers, but surf web pages. But nonetheless, that's the way the world works because we have more and more power, and so the programmers can use that to develop. But they used to be hacking was about hacking and making a system better, figuring out things, how it worked, reverse engineering, but without any kind of malicious intent. It was all just information. But then, of course, hacking became this evil thing, people breaking into computers to take over, people infecting people's machines to turn them into bots so they could send out spam or steal their credit card information, and of course on and on and on. And so there are a lot of different threat actors, and it's important to understand them because they different types of threat actors will potentially affect your organization differently. For example, one of the common types of threat actors is referred to as script kiddies. Script kiddies are, I always joke that we just had a new crop born. We had Christmas not too long ago. And so every year a new group of kids get their first computer or device. And while many of them download their favorite game or start chatting with their friends or becoming YouTube bloggers, video blog, whatever, a certain percentage every year immediately logs on to the internet. They've heard about this. They've got a friend that's shown them how to do this stuff, and they start downloading various exploit and off-the-shelf downloadable hack tools, basically scripts in most of the case, that have been programmed by somebody else, and they begin to attack. They attack their friend's Minecraft server, or they start just poking around out there on the internet, seeing what they can do. And of course, every year we have this new crop of script kiddies. Some of these will progress on to higher levels of threat actors, including true hackers, if their interest takes them into the world of like us in a class like this, then maybe they'll be white hat hackers working to help protect. And of course, they could go rogue and stay the black hat hackers. So today, hacking in the broadest sense has gone from good to bad to kind of, now you have two sides. But script kiddies are the first batch, and there are estimates that maybe 40% of all the attacks that go on, give or take, and it could be more or less, but the largest sort of chunk is commonly believed to be script kiddies. And you'll see a spike. I run servers and have run them for years and years on the internet, and every year after Christmas going into the new year, I see a spike in the number of attacks because these people got their new computer and they started attacking us. And then, of course, some of them graduate to true hackers. And we have even other classifications, though. We have nation state actors. That's an increasingly growing area, and you can read about that in the paper too. We've accused this country of this, and they've accused this of this. There's rumors that power plants in Ukraine were taken offline by Russian hackers, and all these different things that have happened. And nation states are playing a larger and larger role, not only in very specific areas, like we mentioned the Sputnik virus that attacked the Iranian centrifuges in the courseware, so I'll leave you to read that and that. But we talk about other types of events, and there's some belief that some of the attacks that happened to Sony post the release of the movie about the North Korean leader came from North Korea, or at least North Korea inspired people. But we're also seeing, besides those sort of headline level, a real big growth in players that are trying to steal for industrial espionage reasons. A great way to help your country theoretically gain industrial knowledge is just to steal it. And so some more and more countries are attempting to break into corporate networks to gain intellectual property and things like that. We have, of course, all different kinds of threat actors. There are government players. There are the organized crime members. This is actually probably the biggest growing area. And what happens if somebody who gets into hacking as a kid and progresses from script kiddie, they usually have one of two ways they go. Or I guess you could say three. They go work for the government, sometimes even after they've been caught, or they go work for organizations, and they go work for security researchers or academic and become white hat hackers, or they go the rogue side and go black hat. And most of the time, the biggest motivator today appears to be money. It used to be that early hacking, that more innocent hacking, was about fame. And there's still some of that. A lot of the white hat hackers are definitely still in it for fame. They're in it to, hey, I discovered this. This is cool and neat. This is a new way. Let's fix this. But then, of course, there's the people who want to discover those things and keep them to themselves and use them to break in and to gain money. And so money is a huge motivator these days for most threat actors. And we talk about other motivations, curiosity, nationalism. There are even today, as we know, and you've probably heard about, nebulous entities, groups of hackers that are doing it for either social reasons or supporting or against terrorist causes, or all different kinds of reasons. So we talk about those in the material. It's important to understand them and the different motivations, because script kiddies are one thing. They're going to throw a lot of attacks at you, but they're also not very sophisticated. Many times, if you do the right things, like we talk about in this program, you can stop them. You can just kind of giggle, oh, here they come again, and block, 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 and your systems are defending, and off you go, and you don't worry about it. But the more serious hackers, whatever their motivation, they sometimes will have much more resources and means to become even what we refer to these days as persistent threats, potentially breaking in and sitting quietly in your network for a while if you don't do things or don't monitor. And we're going to talk about all the things you need to do to try to counter those, but you need to understand them up front. In the fourth lesson, then we begin to take some of this and say, okay, well, now we understand kind of what security and cybersecurity is, some of these key terms. We understand some of the roles that we might play in the future, that various people play. And then we now understand, oh, there's all these different attacks and threat actors. So, well, okay, let's put some context in this. One of the biggest things that we have to do is we have to understand the concept of organizational security. We're in cybersecurity, as I said, our job, and the same as IT in general, actually, is to enable our organization. If we work for a company and their job is to make money or to help with a worthy cause and raise money, and we are just off doing our own thing, if there's no company, there's no job, is what it comes down to, whether that's supporting the network or securing the network. And so in cybersecurity, we're supporting the organizational objectives. And so it is important that we put in place, ultimately, a series of policies and procedures that will help control the network and control access to resources and information. And that word, controls, is very important, because you're going to see that again and again. We talk about controls, or any mechanism that is put in place as a protection mechanism. And so you can think of controls in all different categories, and we talk about them in material, but different examples include physical controls, a lock. We obviously lock our houses most of the time. We want to lock our server rooms. We want to lock computers in some cases. We want to lock them down physically. So we have controls. We have technical controls, of course. Things like you have to log in or that there's a firewall there to protect us. We have policy and procedure controls, which I've mentioned, and we'll talk a lot about. You will, over time, see many of these, and you will help, at least, over some of these courses, you will be exposed to creating some of these. And some of these you're familiar with. Most people either have seen a reference to it maybe on the news or TV, or if you've had a job, very high likelihood that you will have had to have seen something like an acceptable use policy. Most companies produce that, and they say what you can and cannot do on their corporate networks. That's part of their security posture. They want to set up that. And of course, if some companies lock things down, you can only do X, Y, and Z, you can't bring your own devices, and that's their choice for various security reasons and what they're going to do behind the scenes to further that. Other companies, of course, are like, hey, bring your own phone, whatever, but then they better have taken other steps to make sure that those phones don't become threats on their network. And of course, there are ways to do that, and it's all planned and thought out in an ideal situation. Other policies include the policies of the password policy. Organizations, you've all run into that. You've created an online site. You just had to, if you're going to watch this video, you very likely are joining the classroom. You've created a Zoom account, for example. So you have to log in, and there's rules. Many average users don't see a password policy in a written statement they sign off on, potentially in their employee manual, but they do if they go work at a place that does that. But us just users on the internet, we're seeing it when it says you must have 8 characters and so many special characters and all these rules. That's a password policy that site has put into place to try to protect their users and their systems and their information. So we also look at some information about why do we defend it, and it's beyond just wanting to keep our information safe and secure. There are some really strong motivations for why a company would want to, or an organization period, would want to do this, why we want to implement security policies and procedures and put into place all this resources and people and technology to protect their information assets. And of course, part of it is money again. There are big fines that can happen to an organization if they have a breach. It's estimated it costs Sony millions of dollars. It's cost lots of other companies millions of dollars. One of the most expensive hacks of all time, at least, well, I shouldn't say that now because things change so fast, but a few years ago, one of the most expensive attacks was the Saudi Arabian National Oil Company was attacked and pretty much shut down. And they were having to, they just had whole machines go down, all kinds of stuff. That's a totally different story. We can talk about it more later if any of you are interested, kind of offline. Or you can read about it, but they just had to bring in a ton of people. They started pulling machines off the net to isolate. They were literally going back to using fax machines to send paperwork because their whole network was just crippled for weeks. And they brought in an army of security and IT consultants to help fix it. They threw money at buying hard drives because they figured that was the only way they could do it. They weren't going to trust now that those machines had been infected. So they were going to take out and replace basically thousands of hard drives on systems, thousands and thousands of systems around their whole country and company and organization. And so the cost of all of that was in the millions of dollars, let alone the direct cost. And there's the lost opportunity cost of same thing that happened with Sony. Not only did they lose money having to pay fines and Bayou identity theft, and I'm a PlayStation person. I got the free games and stuff because of that hack and had to go through the hassle of changing my password. But it cost them a lot of reputation. It cost them people who literally that year chose to buy Xbox instead of PlayStation for their kids the next Christmas. And it wasn't the end of the world for Sony, but for other companies and organizations, these hacks could be the end of the organization if we don't defend. And then there are various regulatory reasons beyond fines. Many states and organizations in the EU and others have rules that say you must disclose if there are breaches. And of course, if you're in certain industries, it's even more so. If you're in finance, healthcare, education, then you have to follow other rules. And we talk about these in the program and a little bit in this lesson that you're required. If you're a person who takes credit cards, you must follow the payment card industry's digital standard. And if you don't, you can lose your right to take credit cards. And of course, if you're not on Amazon, they probably wouldn't lose it in the first place and could survive a short lost, just like Sony had enough money to survive their big hack. But if you're a mid-sized company making tens of thousands of dollars, all your money comes in off some e-commerce website, and it's all credit card driven, and you fail an audit, and you guys aren't compliant, and you ultimately lose your right to process credit cards, then you can see that that could be the end of that company. And so there are many different reasons we talk about as to why we defend. And then there's one other concept that's put into that because of the organizational aspect, information security and organizational security aspects. And this is a concept called the 7 domains of IT. This is important because you will see many times, sort of like knowing the threat actors in general, or knowing some of the key terms like what a threat is and what a vulnerability is. Knowing these domains is important because many times out there you will see discussions of security policies and procedures coached and put into the concept of the 7 domains. And it's a theoretical model that basically takes an entire IT infrastructure and breaks it up into these 7 different areas. The user domain, and that's the people, the users. What is the issues there? The workstation domain, so the clients that they use. When it was originally considered and created, the concept of these, then workstation was mainly viewed as a PC. But today you could look at it as a tablet or any other smart device that people are using, the client device, if you will. And then there's the application server domain, there's the WAN and the LAN and all these different pieces, and it's all covered in the lesson. But it's important that you understand this because in each area we have different things we have to take into account. So some of our policies obviously are driven and headed toward the user. Here's the password policy. Here's the acceptable use. Sign this when you come to work for us. It's part of the HR. But we have policies in other areas. We have policies on how we're going to configure a client workstation, how we're going to set up a router in the WAN, how we're going to set up the firewall. These things in large organizations are documented and written down, and the idea being that they're then implemented consistently. And so you will see that by using this model of the 7 domains, we can break things up and look at different areas and decide what we need to do in each of those areas from a security point of view. And so it's sort of like the CIA model. It's another mental model we can use to think of and sort of subdivide our work into pieces. Instead of just sort of looking at a big company going, well, how do I defend this? Well, let's take it into chunks. We're going to look at it. What are our policies and procedures and practices and software and various things and controls? And what do we need to put in place for the user? What do we need to put in place for the workstation? We're going to have policies of how it's configured. It must be using antivirus. We want the local host firewall, Windows firewall, or whatever firewall running as a secondary host-based firewall to our external firewalls. And we detail this and we go through. And some organizations will have looser standards in different areas depending on their needs. I always use the example, and it's just an easy one to grasp. So, but most companies have a website these days, and 2 different companies looking at their website and looking at what they're exposing to the world. The company that is just sort of putting out their flag, their advertisement, they have maybe a contact us and a map and that kind of stuff on their website. While it may be important to them, it may drive them a lot of business or calls, the site itself may be viewed as less of a risk to them than that company I mentioned a minute ago that's making $10,000 an hour, and that's how they make all their money. So each organization is going to have to look at these 7 domains and look across their own organization and decide. And so this model helps us break up that infrastructure and talk about it. So it's an important one to understand. I believe it's talked about later, though it may have been mentioned briefly in another model that's important, and I'll mention it here because I'm not spacing a little bit as to where it was, but is the OSI model. And this is a model of the network. It breaks the network up into layers so we can look at the network. And once again, it's another one of these models we use because we want to provide protections at the lower levels all the way up to the application level. And so if these models in this first course are causing you any confusion, please let us know. Ask the mentor, ask myself, drop us an email, chat online, and we will try to help you get those clear. So then as we move on to the last lesson, make sure I'm checking my notes here and make sure I didn't forget anything important. Well, one thing I did mention, and I just realized I got to write a bigger set of notes for future, but nonetheless, one lesson back in part of threat actors and threats, and we talked a lot about them, but there's one piece that I always like to talk about and emphasize it's a very important piece, and it's sometimes even broader than people think of. But the concept of social engineering, it's one of those terms that gets thrown out there a lot, and people hear it and see it on the news and different things. But what does it really mean? Well, we talk about that in the lesson, and of course, social engineering is kind of broad, actually. In the broadest sense, it's kind of any kind of activity that you take on that is meant to manipulate your way into a system. You can't call trying to crack passwords social engineering. That's a technical attack. You're trying to crack that system, trying to attack an exploit and get into a server with some kind of injection or whatever the commands are. The attack type is in question. Those are more technical attacks. But if you use social engineering, you're attempting to manipulate somebody into kind of giving you more access than you want to, or letting you get more access than you want to. And so a common attack type today that we see a lot is something called phishing. Well, it's actually an example, at least in the concept of targeted attacks. Spear phishing is an example of social engineering. And in the broadest sense, it still is. Somebody who sends out a fake phishing email, they pick a bank, whatever, pick any big bank. I'm not going to mention any by name, but any of the biggest banks, there's a handful in this country. And so one of those banks, I've seen multiple. I actually bank at smaller, more regional banks, including USA out of San Antonio. And so I have very seldom seen sort of phishing because we're a smaller base. But if you're at one of the huge banks that has literally millions and millions of people that have accounts with them, mortgages and everything else all across the country, then they're a prime target for phishing. Somebody will automate and send out a mail that looks like it's coming from your bank, or it looks like it's coming from a bank, I should say. It may not be yours. Like when I get them, I look at them and giggle. They're obvious. I don't bank with those people, at least not at that level. I may have credit cards or other things there, but my main banking is elsewhere, and my mortgages and things. So if I get an email and your mortgage payment didn't come through, and it's like, no, I don't bank with you. So, but that's the kind of stuff that we even talk about in the program a little bit and in detail. I mentioned some of it in the webinars that I've done too, how to look for some of those things, how to look at the links and the email addresses. And of course, if nothing else, if you're not sure, just go to the site directly. Don't click any link in that email. But that's a common attack, and the person who designed it is trying to social engineer the person, make them believe that their bank needs them to log in and give them this data, needs them to follow this link. And of course, maybe they're not even trying to get the login. They just want you to go to a fake copy of the site that's going to load some, Trojan or some malicious software on your machine. But that's a social engineering piece. And so there are a lot of different examples. One that I think I mentioned in the last video lecture, but I've saved it for lectures usually. It's not in the courseware. But it's one of my favorite examples, is that there was a digital, effectively, bank robbery of a couple different banks up in the Midwest a few years ago. And once again, well, not naming names, but you could probably find the story if you did a little Googling. But the gist of the story is, instead of a brute force attack in and trying to break through firewalls to get in and steal money like you see on the movies, we're going to rewire $2 billion to ourselves. No, they had somebody, they have a team of these people. They had somebody dressed up like an IT tech support person, with a badge, clipboard, bag full of tools, laptop, walked into the bank, and then went to the sort of receptionist or whoever at the beginning, the office manager or whatever, and was like, I'm here to see fix so-and-so, and he's looking through his clipboard. And, and the gist of it, at that point, he really doesn't have he's not the tech person, but they're going on the assumption that in a larger, decent sized organization, heck, even a fairly small one, at any given time, somebody's got a computer problem somewhere in many cases. So sure enough, that person says, oh, Susie's computer or Bill's computer. Yeah, let me take you back there. And they just walk this person in who they assume is the IT person, but who's actually not. Now, these were technical people, and I love this little aspect of their exploit. They get in, this person goes back to whoever's computer was ostensibly broken, and they fixed it. Like whatever was wrong with it. He did the updates, he fixed the virus. I don't know what it was, it doesn't matter. They fixed it. But while they were there and underneath and messing around, they hooked up their own basically Wi-Fi hotspot into the network, and then were able to, from a hotel across the street, basically break into the bank and be inside the firewall and escalate from there. And they, of course, sadly for them, they were found out because they obviously, by using Wi-Fi, couldn't be very far away. So checking some hotel records, and after they got greedy and did it enough times, the pattern emerged, and the authorities finally caught on. But they had done these attacks a couple times. And so that's an amazing example of social engineering. This person social engineered their way into that situation. And I've seen this kind of thing in all different kinds of examples. And it can happen digitally, like with phishing. And particularly in spear phishing, what we're seeing is when an attacker is more of a targeted campaign, then what they're doing is doing some research on that entity. And then they're trying to craft that email even more precisely than the blanket. Okay, here's your, we know half the country banks at this bank, or half the country uses this service, so we're going to spend out a fish that hopefully we'll catch some of them. It's kind of big net fishing. But if they're actually targeting your company, and so now they've researched your chief information officer or your sales manager or whatever online, looked at their Facebook, learned a bunch about them, and then sent an email in a more targeted campaign, then that's also an example of social engineering, even though it was using a digital tool. I know of an example with a client of mine some time back that had a perfect storm of that happen, where hackers had actually broken into another, not the company they were targeting, but a place where one of those people was involved, a nonprofit, which had weaker security. Once they were in there and had access to the target's email and some information, they learned enough to then ultimately be able to form and craft a targeted email toward that person who thought it was real, and they clicked on that link and thus basically got something, a backdoor installed on their computer, which was used to transfer money by wire transfers over the weekend until the security and the banks got involved and caught that. They weren't a client before, but I was brought in to help look at that and analyze that network, and even went so far as to take that virus payload and put it into a secure VM environment so I could infect another machine and analyze it and look at it. And those are the kind of things that obviously we do in a forensic and investigative sense, but the attack was a very targeted, when we figured out where it came from and how they had done it, very targeted social engineering spear phishing campaign. And so social engineering involves any kind of thing, it's a place where you're trying to manipulate. I've seen references to and read about and heard about people going into businesses ostensibly to visit, to file a complaint, to try to make a sale, get some information. And while they're there, they're really gathering information or hoping that they will be able to social engineer their way into being left in a room with a network jack for a while, or whatever the case is, so that they can take the next step. So before I go on to the last lesson, let me throw that social engineering piece in. It's also something that most people find kind of interesting, and once you start reading about how some of this has been done, it's kind of fascinating, some of the stories. So our last last lesson, I shouldn't say, it's not a book, it's online, but our last lesson in the first half of this Security Foundations class is on defense basics. And these are basically, we look at, I'm sorry, looking at my notes again. We look at a number of different aspects of that, including some issues about the challenges we face. We face some huge challenges in this space. It was bad enough years ago, but today, as I mentioned earlier, with this growth of the Internet of Things, it is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge to defend corporate networks, information, and organizations' security. Because there's so many more threats. We are on a completely interconnected world, so our attackers can come from anywhere in the world, and they can actually, of course, take over and use machines from all over the world to compound the effort and hide their tracks. It's very common to, of course, for various attackers to either use a lot of automatic tools and automatic bots. Maybe they've taken over a bunch of machines. A very common trick, for example, today that's different than years ago was, it used to be years ago, if somebody was out there, some hacker or script kiddie, and they were going to password attack a machine, then they would be pounding away. And if you were looking at your logs and doing your job as a security person, it was actually pretty easy to figure this out. Okay, so that's why we have so many of these. After so many login attempts, you get logged out because they're trying to stop that kind of stuff. And of course, we could put defenses in place that would say, oh, here's a login attempt on an invalid account, maybe the root or administrator account that if we did right, we've disallowed, so it's not going to work anyway, but we've disallowed that from outside, but we see it happening. Well, that's a perfect thing to just ban them. block that IP. You know it's infected, you know it's a hacker, you know it's something. But it used to be easy because they would come, and sometimes just the script or the person, the script kiddie, if it was a person, or just a bot, if it was running in the background on somebody's machine, it would just pound away, and you just see failed login, failed login, failed login, failed login in the logs, just scrolling by. And well, of course, we got smart to that. So after so many logins, we lock you out. After so many logins, we block your IP in our firewall or in our host files or whatever it is we're doing for our systems, and we never have to worry about you again. You're done. And well, that was a simpler day. Today, of course, because of those countermeasures to stop that brute force attacking, the hackers have gotten much smarter. Now they will take over thousands of machines, whether home machines, now these embedded and Internet of Things machines and devices as well today, servers. It's becoming very popular for attackers to take over, if they can, server farms. And if you think about it, especially all the stuff we're doing up in the cloud and virtual hosting and servers that are hosted all over the world at these big data centers, then there'll be potentially thousands of instances of these servers that are all created the same way with the base software and the base setup, even if they're being used for different entities or different companies or different organizations. But if there's a flaw in one, then you will see whole swaths of them taken over at once, whole ranges of IPs that have been exploited. And then what the hackers do is they'll put their software to do that brute force attack on all of those machines. And they will then very sadly, smartly in this case, then have each of those machines. Say if they're attacking your server, or I'm that hacker, then I'm going to have this machine attack you once, this machine attack you once, this machine attack you once, this machine. And so you're going to see one failed login attempt, and then another IP and a failed login attempt. You're never hitting that 3 to lock the account, and we're not tripping any alarms potentially of some of those earlier intrusion detections, or just patterns of seeing, oh, well, whatever XYZ IP is hitting us 1,000 times, let's stop that. And so now they're spreading these attacks around. The same thing it used to be. They would love to have taken over a mail server in the early days so they could send mail, but then we got better protection of that. So for a while, malware and hackers was really targeted at home users. The idea being we could take over a whole bunch of home computers and in the background have them send out spam. And that'll go through those individual, Time Warner, Comcast, AT&T, whoever ISPs, and they'll end up sending it for us, so it doesn't cost us anything. And we spread that load across all those computers. But of course, like I said, then things, while that's still a semi-popular target, now these server farms are becoming bigger and bigger targets, because if you can take over a handful of those servers, you can do the same thing, but on scale, because we're not talking about a home computer with limited resources. We're talking now I've got a whole server farm or a whole rack that I've taken over, maybe literally thousands of virtual servers that can all spin up and send out all kinds of stuff. And so these challenges just keep growing in the space. We of course, do this, as I mentioned before, in the information security and other part, we do this to avoid cost and to avoid downtime and to achieve our organizational objectives. We want to protect. And so some of the concepts that we then cover in 5 are some very important concepts. And some of these you may have heard of in even other contexts. The first one particularly, either a concept of either layered security or defense in depth, are kind of used almost synonymously. But the concept is that you have to have more than one layer. You don't want to just have a lock on your door. And if you think of it, most homes, we have a lock, but we also usually then inside have some other locks, maybe a bolt lock or a chain lock. And so the idea being that we have layers of security. And of course, some people have more than that. They have motion detectors inside cameras that fire up with motion detection, maybe infrared. And if you really are really worried about your, you may have guards and dogs and fences and all these different layers. So that is a defense in depth. We have a fence, a perimeter fence, electrified if we're really out there. We have Dobermans running around there, and we have another layer. We have check-in security guards. You finally get in, you somehow get in the door. You've gotten past so many layers, and then the infrared detectors and the cameras are recording everything. So that's layers of defense at a physical residence or a building. And so in a network and in a computing situation, we want the same thing. We want to have physical protection. There was an interesting story a couple years ago of a small startup that had actually apparently done a really good job of protecting themselves. That they had something somebody wanted, data, information, software. I don't remember exactly what they did, but there's some intellectual property. And apparently the hackers had been frustrated trying to get in from the outside, so they literally just broke through the window and went in and stole a hard drive. And so, having physical security is important. You need to secure, and so in cybersecurity, though, we may dovetail with the physical plant in the sense that we want to understand if we have a need to be secure enough, then we're going to make sure that we have cameras and security guards and check-ins and badges and all that stuff. And we're going to be part of that process. The building and the whole company may have it for other reasons to protect other assets, somebody stealing the diamonds at a jewelry shop. But if we're doing the IT, we want that to protect the servers and the computers as well, let alone the diamonds. And so we want a layered defense. We want physical controls. We want procedural controls of rules and policies. You can't take information out. You have to follow these guidelines, have these password strings, change your password so often. We want to put technical controls in place so that we have a firewall, but we don't just want one. We want multiple. And but anyway, one of the things that I wanted to point out in that example of defense in depth, I mentioned a lot of other types. In the courseware, a lot of times we, for ease, talk about different types of equipment. And while that's important, and it is, there's different ways to have defense in depth by layering different equipment. Theoretically, you could have layers of firewalls, but if they were just one, just the same type of, it's not quite as valuable, because if one hacker or attacker can get through one, he can probably get through all of them. So we want to look at other concepts as well, and we'll talk about those in the coming lessons, such as diversity. But in the case of just defense in depth, it's not all about equipment. Yes, there's a layer of defense in depth equipment. Maybe we have firewalls, we have intrusion detection, we have monitoring software, we have other types of stuff. But we have to surround that in a true layered defense with those other aspects as well of rules and procedures and physical controls. There are some other concepts we talk about to wrap up this lesson 5 that fit into that same area, including separation of duties and rotation of duties. In a smaller organization, this is not as easy to do, but something to look at and to plan for, if nothing else, when growth happens. But in larger organizations, it is very common to have people break up. So we might have a system administrator whose job is to administer a server, and a security administrator, system administrator, whose job is to secure those things. And we might have broken things up even more. We have people who manage the databases and the websites and different pieces. And we don't want them to all have the keys to the candy store, so to speak. Each person could do their own thing. And then occasionally, in bigger organizations particularly, we rotate those roles. That way, the person who runs that database he or she's figured out a way to, I can insert some stuff in here and I can pull this out. I can make some money in some way, shape, or form, exploiting the system. But if they're rotated out, then the next person coming in theoretically gives you a chance to catch that. So by rotating duties and separating duties, we can gain a lot of degree of, in a sense, defense in depth, and it all fits in. All of these things, as we'll talk about later, where you go with an individual organization is all about the organization's needs and achieving its objectives. But these are some of the important concepts you'll see again and again, and you will definitely use and implement as you implement security procedures and policies for organizations you work for in the future. So I've gone a little long, and we don't have any questions at this point. So I will end this session. As I said, my name is Lee McWhorter. Look forward to helping you throughout the rest of the cybersecurity program. If you have any questions, let me know, or talk to our mentor. And we look forward to seeing you next week for the next lecture. Thanks so much.